60 feet beneath the surface of a Norwegian lake, a sunken warplane from 1940 waited in the dark for 64 years. A Heinkel 111 bomber upside down on the lake bed, Nazi markings still visible through the sediment. She was abandoned on the ice during the German invasion. When the spring thaw came, she slipped beneath the water and vanished from history. In 2004, a diver's light found her, remarkably intact, perfectly preserved in the cold, fresh water. The landing gear pointed up toward the surface. The cockpit instruments were still there, but the most extraordinary discovery came later. The pilot who crash-landed this plane on the frozen lake in April 1940 was still alive, and he was about to see his warplane again. How did a routine mission end with this bomber at the bottom of a lake? And what happened when the pilot finally came face-to-face with the machine he thought was lost forever? Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more untold stories where the history books buried the details that mattered most. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. April 2004. The morning mist hung low over Lake Jonsvanne in central Norway, a gray shroud that turned the water into something otherworldly. The air was cold enough to bite even in spring, and the surface of the lake lay perfectly still. Beneath that mirror of water in the silent dark 60 feet down, something impossible was waiting. Leif Grunvold checked his dive gear one last time before descending. He was an experienced member of the local dive club, and this wasn't a recreational outing. For months, his team had been surveying the lake, searching for confirmation of the old stories, the legends that had persisted for more than 6 decades. The elders in the nearby towns spoke of it sometimes, usually over coffee or beer, their voices dropping to that particular tone people use when they're not entirely sure they should be believed. During the war, they said, the Germans had used the frozen lake as an airfield. When the ice melted in the spring of 1940, the planes went down with it. Most people dismissed it as folklore, the kind of tale that grows more elaborate with each telling. But Leif and his team had done their research. The wartime records hinted at something real beneath the rumors. The cold water closed over him as he descended, his light cutting through the darkness in a narrow beam. The lake bed came into view slowly, a landscape of silt and stone that had remained undisturbed for decades. He swept his light methodically, following the search pattern they had established. Then, without warning, the beam caught something that stopped him cold. Metal. A vast expanse of it, emerging from the sediment like the hull of a ship. But this was no ship. Leif moved closer, his breathing steady despite the surge of adrenaline. The object resolved itself into something unmistakable, an aircraft resting upside down on the lake bed. The landing gear pointed upward toward the surface like accusing fingers. The wings stretched out on either side, still remarkably intact after all these years. And there, barely visible through the accumulated sediment of more than 6 decades, were markings that made his heart race. A swastika on the tail fin, Luftwaffe crosses on the wings. This wasn't just any aircraft. This was a German warplane, and it had been sitting here perfectly preserved since the spring of 1940. When Grunvold surfaced and reported what he'd found, word spread quickly through Norway's tight-knit community of aviation historians. The initial identification came within days. A Heinkel He-111 medium bomber, one of the Luftwaffe's primary workhorses in the early years of the war. The registration codes were faint but still readable through the sediment. 6N plus NH. Einar Bratteli, a historian who had spent years studying the German invasion of Norway, pulled the relevant archives and began cross-referencing. The codes matched records from the Norwegian campaign. This bomber hadn't been lost on the first chaotic day of the invasion, as some of the other wrecks in the area had been. This plane had been part of the subsequent operations, flying missions from the improvised German airbase that had been established on the frozen lake itself. The presence of the wreck wasn't a complete surprise. The older residents of the area had always known that the Germans used Lake Jonsvanne during those frantic weeks in April 1940. The Wehrmacht had arrived with startling speed, and the Luftwaffe needed forward bases to support the ground campaign and attack Allied positions along the coast. The thick ice of the lake had been pressed into service as what the Germans called an Eisplatz, an ice runway. It was a desperate, audacious solution to a logistical problem, and it had worked, at least for a few weeks. But as the spring thaw began, that temporary airfield became a trap. Aircraft that couldn't be moved in time simply disappeared beneath the water when the ice gave way. The real questions that emerged weren't about whether the plane was there, it was, but about its specific story. What mission had this bomber been flying? Why had it ended up abandoned on the ice? And most intriguingly, how had it remained so perfectly preserved? Freshwater lakes don't corrode metal the way saltwater does, but even so, the condition of this aircraft was extraordinary. The fuselage was intact. The engines were still attached. Even some of the cockpit instruments appeared to be in place. It was as if the plane had simply been frozen in time, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. As Brottley continued his archival work, the story began to take shape. April 1940. The date was confirmed in multiple sources. After the initial invasion, the Luftwaffe had indeed operated from the frozen surface of Lake Jonsvanne. This particular Heinkel had force-landed on the ice after returning from a combat mission. The damage it had sustained made it unserviceable, and with the spring thaw approaching, the Germans had simply abandoned it. When the ice broke up, the bomber had slipped beneath the surface and come to rest on the lake bed where it had remained undisturbed for 64 years. It was a footnote in the vast chaos of the war, a single aircraft among tens of thousands lost across Europe. But now, thanks to Leif Grunwald's persistence, it was about to become something more. For 64 years, she had been waiting in the darkness. Now, someone was finally asking what had happened. And as the Norwegian authorities began to consider the possibility of a recovery operation, one thing became clear. This would be more than salvage. This would be an act of archaeology, a chance to recover not just an aircraft, but a piece of living history. But first, they needed to understand the full story. To know why this plane was here, they would have to go back to April 1940, to the mission that brought her to an icy runway that was destined to disappear. April 1940. Germany had invaded Norway just days earlier in Operation Weserübung, one of the most audacious combined operations of the early war. The Wehrmacht had struck with devastating speed, seizing key ports and airfields along the Norwegian coast in a coordinated assault that caught the Norwegians and their British allies almost completely by surprise. Now, with the initial shock of the invasion behind them, German forces were working frantically to consolidate their positions and push inland. Near Trondheim, Norway's third-largest city, the Luftwaffe faced a critical challenge. They needed forward air bases to support ground operations and strike at Allied forces attempting to organize a counteroffensive. Traditional airfields were either damaged, inadequate, or still contested. The solution was improvised, dangerous, and entirely characteristic of the Wehrmacht's approach in those early months of the war. They would use the frozen surface of Lake Jonsvanne as a temporary airfield. The lake just outside Trondheim was covered in thick ice in early April. German engineers surveyed it, deemed it suitable, and within days the Luftwaffe had established what they called an Eisplatz, an ice runway. It was a calculated risk. Spring was approaching, and the thaw was inevitable. But for a few critical weeks, the ice held, and the lake became home to a small detachment of bombers tasked with striking Allied positions along the coast. Among those aircraft was a Heinkel Ha-111, registration 6N+1H, a twin-engine medium bomber that had become the workhorse of the early Luftwaffe. The Heinkel Ha-111 was in many ways emblematic of Germany's rearmament in the years before the war. Initially designed to look like a civilian transport aircraft to circumvent the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, it had been revealed as a weapon during the Spanish Civil War, where it proved itself in combat. By 1940, it was proven but increasingly vulnerable, especially at low altitude where anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters could exploit its relatively modest speed and defensive armament. It carried a crew of 5, a pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and a dorsal gunner. They worked in cramped quarters, surrounded by fuel tanks, bombs, and ammunition, flying missions that ranged from tactical support to strategic bombing. The crew of 6N plus NH was led by their pilot, Artur von Casimir, a young officer who had already logged hundreds of combat hours. He and his 4 crewmates were professionals trained in the exacting standards of the Luftwaffe's pre-war expansion. For them, the Norwegian campaign was a strange mix of tension and routine. The missions were dangerous, the weather was brutal, and the Allied resistance was stiffening as British forces poured into the region. But they were flying from an ice runway on a frozen lake, an operational reality so bizarre that it felt almost surreal. Every takeoff carried the additional risk that the ice might give way. Every landing was a gamble that the surface would hold, and with each passing day, the spring sun grew stronger. On the morning of April 20th, 1940, von Casimir and his crew received their mission briefing on the shores of Lake Jonsvanne. The target was Namsos, a coastal town to the northwest where Allied forces had established a significant presence. British and Norwegian troops were attempting to organize a coordinated defense, and the Luftwaffe's job was to disrupt them, destroy supplies, and break their will to resist. The weather forecast was grim. Low clouds and the risk of icing at altitude. Expected resistance was heavy. The British had moved anti-aircraft batteries into the area, and the Allies were fully aware that German bombers were operating in the region. This would not be an easy mission. The crew boarded their Heinkel in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The engines coughed to life with the characteristic growl of the Jumeau power plants, and after the routine checks, von Casimir advanced the throttles. The bomber accelerated across the ice, the surface groaning beneath its weight, and then lifted into the gray sky. They climbed out over the fjords, heading northwest toward the target, flying low to avoid detection. The landscape below was stark and beautiful, all mountains and water and snow, but the crew had little time to appreciate it. They were focused on the mission ahead. Over Namsos, they encountered exactly what the briefing had warned them about. British anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, black bursts of flak that bracketed the bomber as von Casimir maneuvered to line up his approach. The bombardier released their payload and the aircraft lurched upward, freed of the weight. But before they could clear the target area, the bomber took hits. The sharp crack of shrapnel punching through aluminum was unmistakable, and almost immediately the crew knew they were in trouble. One of the engines began to lose power. Oil pressure dropped. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. The mission was complete, but the aircraft was crippled, and they were still a long way from base. Von Casimir fought the controls as they limped south, nursing the damaged bomber back toward Trondheim. The healthy engine roared at full power, but it wasn't enough. They were losing altitude steadily, and the mountains below offered no margin for error. The pilot made his decision quickly. They would try to make it back to the ice plots on Lake Jonsvanne. It was their only option. A crash landing in the mountains meant almost certain death. The frozen lake, at least, offered a flat surface and the possibility of survival. He radioed ahead, informing the ground crew of their condition and requesting emergency procedures. The response was terse and professional. They would be ready. As the lake came into view, von Casimir lined up his approach. The crew braced themselves, each man alone with his thoughts in the cramped fuselage. The landing gear remained retracted. There was no point risking it on ice. This would be a belly landing, metal on ice, and the best they could hope for was to walk away. The bomber descended toward the frozen surface, the single working engine straining, and von Casimir prepared for the impact that would determine whether they lived or died. They were returning to their base, but their warplane would never leave it. What happened next would be hidden for more than 6 decades. The Heinkel came in low over the frozen surface of Lake Jonsvanne in the early morning light of April 20th, 1940. Von Casimir held the aircraft as steady as he could, compensating for the failed engine and the damage they had taken over Namsos. The ice rushed up to meet them, and then the impact came, a violent shriek of tortured metal as the bomber's belly struck the frozen surface. The aircraft slid forward in a shower of ice crystals and grinding aluminum, the nose pitching down slightly before the momentum carried them onward. Inside the fuselage, the crew was thrown against their restraints, equipment breaking loose and clattering through the confined space. For several long seconds, the world was nothing but noise and motion. Then, gradually, impossibly, the Heinkel slowed and came to rest. The silence that followed was almost shocking. Von Casimir cut the remaining engine and sat motionless for a moment, his hands still gripping the controls. Around him, his crew began to move, checking themselves for injuries, releasing their harnesses with shaking hands. They had survived. The emergency hatch was opened, and one by one the 5 men climbed out onto the ice, their legs unsteady, their faces pale with the aftermath of adrenaline. Ground crew from the makeshift base were already running toward them across the frozen lake, and within minutes the immediate crisis was over. The Yajabaona crew was safe. The bomber, however, was not. The damage assessment came quickly. The flak hits over Namsos had torn through critical systems, and the hard landing on the ice had compounded the destruction. The starboard engine was completely ruined, its cowling crumpled and oil streaking the wing. The fuselage was twisted in places, stress fractures running along the aluminum skin. The landing gear mechanism was damaged beyond field repair. Most critically, structural components that would require a fully equipped maintenance depot to fix were bent or broken. The verdict was unanimous. The aircraft was unserviceable. She would not fly again, at least not from this improvised airfield on the ice. For von Casimir and his crew, the mission was over. They were reassigned to other duties almost immediately. In the chaos of the Norwegian campaign, there was no time for sentiment. Pilots were needed, bombardiers were needed, and one damaged aircraft among dozens was simply a fact of war. The Heinkel 6N+NH became just another piece of equipment that had failed at the wrong time in the wrong place. There was no dramatic ceremony, no formal farewell. The ground crews stripped her of anything useful, the machine guns from her defensive positions, the radio equipment, instruments that could be salvaged and installed in other aircraft. Within days, the bomber was little more than an empty shell sitting on the ice, a ghost on the temporary runway. And then the weather began to change. Spring was arriving in central Norway, and with it came the inevitable thaw. The ice on Lake Jonsvannet, which had seemed so solid just weeks before, began to groan and crack. Meltwater pooled on the surface during the day, refreezing at night into treacherous patches. The Luftwaffe ground crews watched the conditions carefully, knowing their time on the ice plots was limited. Other aircraft were flown out to more permanent bases. Equipment was packed and transported. The temporary structures on the shore were dismantled, but the damaged Heinkel remained where she had come to rest, too heavy to move, too damaged to fly, and ultimately too insignificant to warrant extraordinary measures. She was abandoned, left to whatever fate the spring would bring. That fate came on a morning when the ice finally surrendered to the sun. The frozen surface that had held the weight of bombers for weeks gave way with a sound like artillery. Cracks raced across the lake, spreading in jagged patterns as the ice broke into massive plates. The abandoned Heinkel, sitting motionless on the surface, shifted as the ice beneath her fractured. Then, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, she began to slide. The nose dipped forward, the tail rose, and the bomber slipped into the frigid water of Lake Jonsvannet. As she sank, the aircraft rolled inverted, the laws of physics and the distribution of weight in her empty fuselage conspiring to turn her upside down. The landing gear still retracted. Into the wings, now pointed upward toward the surface, she was leaving behind. 60 feet down, she came to rest on the lake bed, her wings settling into the silt, her fuselage creating a dark shadow in the depths. The lake closed over her, and the Heinkel disappeared from the world above. The cold, fresh water began its work of preservation immediately. There was no salt to corrode the aluminum, no strong currents to tear at the structure. The temperature at the bottom of the lake remained constant year-round, just above freezing. Silt settled over the aircraft slowly, gently, covering the Nazi markings and the scarred metal. Within months, she was invisible from the surface, a dark shape that only the deepest diving fish might encounter. She became a secret, known only to the water and the darkness. Above, the war moved on with relentless momentum. Norway fell to German control, though resistance continued in various forms throughout the occupation. The Luftwaffe flew thousands more missions from dozens of airfields. Hundreds of aircraft were lost, shot down, crashed, destroyed on the ground. In the vast accounting of the war, one Heinkel bomber lost to a spring thaw was not even a footnote. It was invisible, insignificant, forgotten. Von Casimir and his crew survived the war, scattered to different fates by the grinding machinery of conflict. The lake returned to peace in 1945, and the decades began to pass. In the 1970s and 1980s, the old stories persisted among local residents. The elders who remembered the German occupation would sometimes mention the planes that had operated from the frozen lake and how some had gone down when the ice melted. But memories fade, details become uncertain, and the stories took on the quality of legend. By the 1990s, recreational diving had become popular in Norway, and Lake Jonsvannet attracted its share of divers exploring the clear water and rocky depths. But the deep-water wrecks remained undisturbed, their locations lost to time, their existence doubted by those who had not lived through that strange spring of 1940. For 64 years, the Heinkel rested in the dark, a witness to nothing but the slow passage of time and the patient work of the lake, until Leif Grunvold's light found her, and history came calling once more. In 2004, the decision was made: bring her home. The planning for the recovery operation began in the summer of 2004, and from the outset it was clear this would be no simple salvage job. Norwegian authorities, aviation historians, and technical dive teams gathered to assess the challenges and develop a strategy. The Heinkel rested 60 feet down in near-freezing water, upside down, partially embedded in the lake bed. The aircraft weighed approximately 12 tons, and after 64 years underwater, no one could be certain of its structural integrity. Would the fuselage hold together when lifted, or would it disintegrate the moment stress was applied? The goal was preservation, not merely recovery. This was archaeology, a chance to bring a piece of history back to the surface intact, and that meant every step had to be carefully planned and executed. The dive team that would handle the underwater work was led by experienced technical divers accustomed to working in challenging conditions. Every dive into the lake was meticulously planned. At 60 feet, the water temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to limit bottom time and require careful management of equipment and physiology. The divers made multiple descents, each one building on the information gathered during the previous visit. High-resolution cameras documented every angle of the wreck. Measurements were taken, the condition of critical structural points was assessed. Slowly, a detailed picture emerged of what they were dealing with. What they found was extraordinary. The Heinkel was remarkably intact despite its inverted position and the decades it had spent on the lake bed. The wings were still attached to the fuselage, the twin engines mounted in their nacelles. The tail section, with its distinctive Nazi markings, remained structurally sound. The cockpit glass was gone, shattered or corroded away, but the instruments inside were still visible, frozen in their last positions. Control yokes, throttle quadrants, gauges, all were there, ghostly reminders of the men who had once operated them. The swastika on the vertical stabilizer was clearly visible once the silt was carefully cleared away, as were the Luftwaffe crosses on the wings. It was a haunting sight, this machine of war resting in silent testimony to a conflict that had ended nearly 60 years before. As the divers explored the wreck, artifacts began to emerge from the silt in the interior of the fuselage. Personal items that had somehow survived the decades underwater told intimate stories of the men who had flown this aircraft. A leather flying glove, stiff with age but recognizable. A thermos, its metal surface corroded but its shape intact. Most remarkably, a flight log was discovered, its pages miraculously preserved by the cold water and the particular chemistry of the lake bed. Maps, ammunition still loaded in the defensive gun positions, pieces of radio equipment, each item was carefully documented and, where possible, recovered for conservation. Then came a discovery that transformed the entire project from a historical recovery into something far more profound. As historians worked to piece together the story of this specific aircraft, cross-referencing the registration codes with wartime records and survivor accounts, they made contact with a name that appeared again and again in the documentation. Artur von Casimir, the pilot who had crash-landed this Heinkel on the ice of Lake Jonsvanne in April 1940. A routine record search revealed something stunning. Von Casimir was still alive. He was 96 years old, living quietly in Germany, and when contacted by the historians, he agreed to something extraordinary. He would return to Norway to witness the recovery of the aircraft he had last seen sliding across the ice 64 years earlier. The lift operation was scheduled for September 2004. A crane barge was positioned over the wreck site, its outriggers stabilized to handle the tremendous weight and the delicate balance required. Massive airbags were attached to the aircraft by the dive team, positioned carefully to distribute the lifting force and prevent structural failure. On the shore of Lake Jonsvanne, a crowd gathered, local residents, media, historians, and standing among them, an elderly man in a dark coat watching the water with an intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than the present moment. Artur von Casimir had returned. The operation began in the early morning. Compressors filled the airbags with air, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the Heinkel began to rise from the lake bed where it had rested since the spring of 1940. The divers monitored every stage of the ascent, ready to adjust if anything went wrong. On the surface, the crane took up the slack in the lifting cables, adding controlled force to the buoyancy of the airbags. The crowd on the shore fell silent, watching the water. Local news cameras rolled, capturing the moment for posterity. And then she broke the surface. 64 years after she had slipped beneath the water, the Heinkel saw daylight again. Water streamed from the inverted fuselage in sheets, pouring from every seam and opening. The landing gear, still pointing skyward, emerged first, followed by the belly of the aircraft with its scars from the ice landing still visible. The wings came next, dripping, covered in algae and sediment, but unmistakably intact. The tail section rose last, the swastika clearly visible to everyone watching. There was a moment of collective breath-holding, and then applause broke out across the shore. Not celebration of what the aircraft had represented, but recognition of what had been accomplished, history reclaimed from the depths, a tangible connection to the past restored. Von Casimir stood watching, his face unreadable. Around him, people were crying, moved by the sheer improbability of the moment. The bomber was carefully maneuvered to shore and secured. The old pilot walked forward slowly, accompanied by historians and officials, and stood before the aircraft he had last touched as a young man in the chaos of war. The reunion of man and machine, separated by more than 6 decades, was captured by dozens of cameras. But the private thoughts of Artur von Casimir in that moment remained his own. The aircraft was transported to a secure hangar where a team from the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin waited to begin the long process of conservation. With von Casimir providing first-hand testimony, every detail of the bomber's final mission could now be confirmed and documented. The lake had kept her secret for 64 years. Now, with the help of the man who had flown her, the world would know the truth. The Heinkel He-111 was transported to the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin, where a team of conservators and aviation specialists began the painstaking work of preservation. The decision was made early in the process not to restore the aircraft to flying condition or even to its original appearance. Instead, the bomber would be preserved exactly as it had been found, a time capsule from the lake bed, bearing the marks of its combat mission, its emergency landing, and its 64 years underwater. Every scar told part of the story, and the conservators understood that their job was not to erase history, but to stabilize it, to ensure that this remarkable survivor could continue to bear witness for generations to come. Artur von Casimir became central to the aircraft's story in ways that went far beyond simple historical verification. He provided interviews that filled in details no archival document could capture. He spoke about the mission to Namsos, the fear and focus in the moments when the flak found them, the calculation he had made in choosing to attempt the ice landing rather than risk the mountains. He remembered his crew members by name, their faces, their roles in keeping the damaged bomber airborne long enough to reach the lake. He described the sound the aircraft made sliding across the ice, the relief when they realized they had all survived, and the strange emptiness of walking away from the machine, knowing it would never fly again. His testimony was recorded, transcribed, and incorporated into the growing body of documentation surrounding the recovery. But perhaps more important than the facts he provided was his simple presence, proof that history is not an abstraction, that the machines we recover from lakes and battlefields were operated by real men who went on to live real lives. Von Casimir returned to Norway at the invitation of the recovery team and the Norwegian government. The visit was carefully planned to honor both the historical significance of the recovery and the complex emotions it might evoke. At Lake Jonsvanne, he met Leif Grunvold, the diver whose light had first found the bomber in the darkness 60 feet down. The two men shook hands on the shore where the aircraft had been brought up from the water, representatives of different generations connected by a single machine and the improbable fact of its rediscovery. Grunvold later said that meeting von Casimir changed how he understood his own role in the story. He had thought of himself as someone recovering a piece of metal and history. Meeting the pilot made him realize he had helped restore a fragment of a man's life, a memory made tangible. The meetings between von Casimir and local Norwegians who had lived through the German occupation were marked by a quiet respect that spoke to the passage of time and the evolution of memory. These were not encounters between enemies, but between people who had experienced the same historical moment from different perspectives, and who now, in the autumn of their lives, could acknowledge the shared humanity beneath the uniforms and the politics. An elderly Norwegian man who had been a teenager during the occupation told von Casimir that the sound of German aircraft had terrified him as a boy. But seeing the bomber recovered from the lake had reminded him that those aircraft had been flown by young men not much older than he had been, men who were also subject to fear and fate. Another Norwegian, who had watched the recovery from the shore, said later that war had made them enemies, but time and this machine had brought them together to remember, and that perhaps memory was the only honest victory any of them could claim. The broader meaning of the recovery began to emerge as the aircraft took its place in the museum and as the story spread through documentaries, articles, and exhibitions. The Heinkel became a teaching tool, but not in the way military aircraft often do. Its story was not one of glorious combat or strategic significance. It was a story of mechanical failure, bad weather, and survival. It was about 5 men who flew a mission, took damage, made it back to base, and walked away. It was about the mundane and perilous reality of war, the fact that for every dramatic battle there were thousands of missions that simply went wrong in ordinary ways. The bomber served as a bridge between eras, tangible proof that the past was not a collection of abstractions and statistics, but a time when real people operated real machines and made real decisions with real consequences. Leif Grunvold gave numerous interviews in the years following the recovery. He spoke about the moment his light found the aircraft and how it felt to realize the legends were true. But he also reflected on what the discovery had taught him about the nature of history itself. He said he had been looking for a piece of the past, an artifact to document and study. He had never imagined they would find the man who had lived it. The aircraft, he said, reminded him that history was not just in books and archives. It was under their feet, in their lakes, embedded in the landscape, and preserved in the memories of those who had been there. Every artifact had a story, and every story deserved to be told, not because the events were necessarily momentous, but because they were real and because the people involved were real. The universal message that emerged from the Heinkel's recovery was one that resonated far beyond military history enthusiasts. This was one bomber among thousands, her crew 5 men among millions who served. In the vast machinery of the Second World War, she should have been completely insignificant. But because she was found, because her pilot survived to tell her tale, because people cared enough to bring her up from the lake and preserve her story, their moment in time was no longer lost. The recovery became proof that individual experiences matter, that ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances deserve to be remembered, and that the effort to preserve and understand the past is an act of respect for everyone who lived it. In the museum in Berlin, the preserved Heinkel became the centerpiece of an exhibit that drew visitors from around the world. Displayed next to the scarred fuselage was a large photograph of a young Artur von Casimir in his Luftwaffe uniform, his face serious beneath his flight cap, the image of a man at the beginning of his story. Von Casimir visited the exhibit with his family, and photographers captured him standing before the aircraft, one hand resting on the cold metal of the fuselage. He was 96 years old, looking at the machine that had carried him through one of the most dangerous moments of his youth, a machine that had waited in the darkness for 64 years before anyone thought to ask its story. The moment was both deeply personal and universally resonant, an old man touching his past, and in doing so, connecting all of us to the reality that history is not distant or abstract, but immediate and human. For 64 years, Lake Jonsvene had held a secret, not a secret of glory, but a secret of time and ice. The Heinkel Ha-111 flew in April 1940 and fell silent that same spring. But in 2004, she spoke again and brought the man who last flew her home to tell her story. She reminds us that wars are fought by nations but paid for by ordinary men, and that every one of them deserves to be remembered. The aircraft rests now in Berlin, preserved and still, a monument not to victory or defeat, but to the simple fact that the past was real and that those who lived it matter.